Kaboom, kapow, boom, shakalaka, we're back. Welcome to this evening's episode of Live with Littlewood, with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Tonight, we're going to ask who's going to get the biggest job in the world and what are they going to do about it and with it? And should we be worried or optimistic? What's the outlook for free markets, whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump prevail? To be clear, it is about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. When I said the most important job in the world, it isn't because Ralph Hasenhüttl has resigned as Southampton manager. I'm talking about the big job across the pond, President of the United States of America, leader of the free world. And tonight we're going to be focusing exclusively on the United States of America, what to expect, what to look for, what's going on, and what might happen next in this most unpredictable of years. So coming up later on the show, polls apart. There's just 5 days to go. What do we think is going to happen? What can we glean from the polls? What are Americans thinking? Will Donald Trump confound most mainstream pollsters, or will it be plain sailing for the Democrat ticket of Biden and Harris? And on the night itself, what should we be looking for? Here at the IEA, we tend to treat elections as acts of God, but be very interested to hear from our guests this evening on what's motivating American voters and what's going through their mind. Then we'll move on to the real deal. What would a Trump second term look like? What kind of administration would Joe Biden bring? And from a UK perspective, will there really be a deal? What would be the prospects of a UK-US trade deal under either Donald Trump or Joe Biden, and for UK-US relations more generally? And then we're going to finish up with America on alert. It's been a turbulent summer right across the world for all sorts of reasons, passions running high on both sides of the political fence. How will American voters respond to the election result? There are fears that dissatisfied voters will take to the streets. Perhaps some will even get violent. Police are bracing themselves for unrest in cities across the country. We've reflected on the disunited states of America before, but will this election, whatever its outcome, deepen those divisions even further, or can the USA become united again? All that and more is coming up over the next 80 minutes or so, and I'm joined as usual by a brilliant cast of pollsters, pundits, commentators, journalists, and think tankers from both sides of the pond. Including and coming up later, Kate Andrews, the economics correspondent of The Spectator, Terry Kibbe, co-founder and chief executive officer of Washington-based Free the People, Morgan Schondelmeier, head of external affairs at the Adam Smith Institute and formerly of this parish, of course, at the IEA, Oliver Wiseman, the US editor of the Critic magazine, and from the home team, my own policy advisor here at the IEA, Alexander Hammond. They'll all be coming up later. But first up, real pleasure to welcome back onto the show my good friend Patrick Basham, the founding director of the Democracy Institute and a pollster who swims pretty successfully, it's fair to say, against the tide. Unlike most, he correctly forecast the Brexit vote and Donald Trump's 2016 win. And his latest polls suggest that Trump may be making up ground and indeed could well be the favourite to win. We'll be finding out why his polls give a different sort of outlook to many others. Good evening to you, or good afternoon to you, Patrick, where you're from in Washington, D.C. How are you keeping, my friend?
Good afternoon, Mark. Pleasure to be with you. Looking forward to the discussion very, very much.
And I'm also delighted to be joined again by Freddy Gray, deputy editor of The Spectator, editor of Spectator USA. He's formerly the literary editor of the American Conservative. He's joining us from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, crucial state. I understand a pretty crucial area in that state. He's recently written that the Biden campaign is sleepwalking its way to victory, but with a warning that Donald Trump is, quote, a terrifyingly good finisher. More on that in just a moment. Freddy, great to see you. Thanks for joining us. How are you keeping?
Great to be here. It's miserable weather here in Pennsylvania. I imagine, Patrick, it's pretty miserable in DC too as well.
Weather's always miserable in DC.
It's either too hot. Yeah, it's usually too hot. It's usually too hot in DC, isn't it?
Oh, so I was referring to the political weather. Yeah.
Patrick, I'm going to start with you. I know you're midway through commissioning a new poll, and as I say, the IEA isn't a partisan or electoral machine, but it's obviously going to have a massive impact on public policy, whoever wins this election. What's been, I mean, not asking you to scoop yourself by telling us the early indications of your final poll, but what's the lay of the land? And I'm going to ask the team to put up a slide at the moment with the who will win. I mean, generally speaking, if you aggregate the opinion polls and are trying to determine who will win, Joe Biden's polling somewhere between 50 and 54%, Donald Trump somewhere between 42 and 46%. And in most circumstances, that would indicate, with only a few days to go, this one's over. I mean, that 5, 6, 7, 8, 10% lead would mean it's in the bag. You're not so sure it's as straightforward as that, are you, Patrick?
No, not at all. I mean, our forthcoming poll in the Sunday Express this weekend will be our 6th monthly poll. And what we found over these past 5 months, and perhaps with the 6th one too, is how remarkably consistent this race has been. And that's one of the ways in which our results have been different to many others. And yes, there have been new issues come along, and there have been bumps in the road for both candidates, especially Donald Trump. But we found it to be throughout, since April, May, a very competitive race, one that in the national popular vote has either been tied or had a narrow lead for Donald Trump. Most recently, we had Trump up by 1 point. But crucially, we have always found Donald Trump with a modest but comfortable lead in the Electoral College, which obviously will actually decide who becomes the president. And the reason for that, and then the reason that even if the, in my view, more inflated polls are nearer the mark, why the Trump campaign would still have hope, is that Donald Trump's vote, as in 2016, is going to be very efficient. So by that I mean he is going to get his votes where he needs them, particularly in those battleground swing states like Pennsylvania, where Freddy is right now. So he may again, and we think he likely will, win a number of critical states by comparatively small margins, whereas you flip it over to the Biden side, and Joe Biden's going to rack up these incredible, impressive wins in California and Illinois and New Jersey and New York and Massachusetts. That may give him a lead in the popular vote. It might even be a few points, but his vote is inefficient. And so he's not going to secure those votes where he most needs them. That is one of the reasons why, even if our polling is wrong, Donald Trump, a few days from the election, still has a good chance.
Interesting. And Freddy, what's your take on it? I mean, Patrick's over there in Washington, D.C., which gets a handful of electoral college vote, and I think about 92% Democrat, isn't it, the District of Columbia? So again, piling up votes in safe seats, as we'd call them here. Freddy, you're in Pennsylvania. What's your view on the ground about, well, I guess Pennsylvania may end up determining the outcome, but more generally, do you think, as I say, if you just looked at the mainstream opinion polls, you'd conclude that Joe Biden's on course to win quite comfortably by 5 or 6%, and that would usually deliver you the presidency in the Electoral College. Do you agree with Patrick, or who are you sort of leaning towards or calling it for in terms of the likely outcome?
I agree with Patrick in the sense I think Donald Trump's got a real chance, and I think the momentum is with him at the moment. And since the last debate, really, where he performed pretty well, a lot of things seem to be going in his favor. And the chief among those is that he's out campaigning. He really is. He's going all across the country, doing up to 4 states a day. And even if you loathe him, I think you have to admire the sheer energy of the man. And I think, I mean, I went to one of these rallies in Pennsylvania recently, and the scale of it was very impressive, especially given that there's a pandemic on. There's a lot of excitement around him. There's huge amounts of enthusiasm sort of throughout the Pennsylvanian countryside. Obviously, this is Trump country in a way. It's the poorer parts of Pennsylvania, rural parts of Pennsylvania. But at the moment, I'm in a slightly one of the more affluent parts of Bethlehem, and there's a lot of Biden-Harris signs there. But these are in the pockets. So if you sort of think about it and just using your eyes going around the country, you would say Trump is going to win this thing by an enormous landslide. But the difficulty is the pandemic and the extent to which this is hiding the Democratic side. I mean, how many Democratic voters are just unwilling to come out and be public and be visible? I think that's a huge unknown. There's just no way we can guess at it, really.
Yeah, that is interesting, because I've on an episode of this show, I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, we were talking about stated preferences, i.e. what you might tell an opinion pollster, and revealed preferences, what you might actually do. And we compared Trump rallies with Biden rallies, and look, it was anecdotal, but it seemed that Trump voters had much more enthusiasm. But I don't know whether that's just that Trump voters are more risk-taking as far as COVID-19 is concerned, and the Democrats are all shielding or wearing their face masks or practicing social distancing. Patrick, tell us a little bit about this sort of enthusiasm point. I mean, I'm always a little bit skeptical, although polls have often been shown to be wrong in recent years, other than your own, I have to say. But usually when I see one candidate or one party ahead, and the other party the party behind says, oh, well, our voters are more enthusiastic. We've got a better ground game on getting out the vote. We'll do better on mail-in ballots or whatever it might be. I kind of think, well, that's the sort of last refuge to try and cheer yourself up when you're losing the match 3-0 with 10 minutes to go. But is there something in that? Have we got to a stage in polling and trying to read people's preferences now that we need to dig a lot deeper into things like enthusiasm and propensity to vote and the rest of it?
We definitely do. I mean, if we go back to 2016, the Trump campaign, it had a controversial, sort of passionate, energetic candidate and a lot of enthusiasm. It didn't have a ground game. It didn't have anything like the money that Hillary's campaign had and all of that. And those were the reasons, those were the things the Trump campaign hung on to, and why most other people, conventional wisdom, said he had no chance. It turned out that enthusiasm and that interesting, controversial character were enough. So we bring us to 2020. And what we find is that Trump now has the ground game. He's had for most of the time quite a lot of money. But in terms of enthusiasm and those other non-polling metrics, the gap between Trump and Biden is historic, really. I mean, in terms of very enthusiastic, very strongly enthusiastic supporters, it's enormous. And what history tells us is that the candidate with the more enthusiastic supporters always wins. And it gets to sort of a larger point. I'm going to say something in the anti-polling realm, which is that if you look at all of the tangible non-polling metrics, primary vote, enthusiasm, social media followers, Google searches, lawn signs, you name it, every single one of them points to a Trump victory. The one that doesn't is the polling metric. And so this is a very interesting experiment or case study in today where the power actually is. But I will throw in one caveat here with the polling. Until recently, generally polling in American presidential elections was fairly good. So 80% of the time it would be accurate. But interestingly, when it hasn't been accurate, those 20%, the non-polling metrics have been. The non-polling metrics have a 100% record. Polling has an 80% record. And so when you see the contrast today, it makes you, whether you're in the polling business or not, you should make one step back and say, are we getting everything? Are we capturing everything? Maybe there is some even more to this enthusiasm, etc., than we thought before.
And Freddy, what do you think we should be sort of looking at as the metrics? Most of us at the IEA are pretty skeptical about forecasting in general. We tend to overstate. People tend to overstate that, how much we can accurately predict the future, whether that's about how people in America are going to vote next Tuesday, or whether it's about the number of COVID deaths or growth in the economy or the number of jobless. It's a damn difficult job predicting the future. I see that I'm told that since 1996, Spirit Halloween, which is a Halloween costume retailer based in New Jersey, has successfully predicted who's going to win the presidency based on which candidate has the best-selling mask. In 2016, Trump got 55% of the sales. The 2020 sales are yet to be announced. Are we as well, Freddie, just to look at a Halloween shop as an indicator of what's going to happen as we are to look at the opinion polls?
I agree. I don't know if you saw the Russian bear had chosen the watermelon with Biden's face on it, which is more Russian interference in the election. I think I don't. I mean, on the polls, I'm ever more baffled by polling. I'm particularly interested in this idea that a lot of the big polling companies have reassured us for the last couple of years that all the mistakes they made in 2016 they've fixed because they now weight things better to take in non-college educated voters. And my sort of cynical know-nothing gut reaction to that is always the more sophisticated they try to make the model, the worse it gets at predicting what's going on. And I think, I mean, for instance, there's a poll, ABC polls come out recently showing Biden 17 points ahead in Wisconsin. Now, I think the Trump campaign, as much as I've been able to understand, do think they may well lose Wisconsin, but not by 17 points is absurd. So that suggests if they're making those, if the big polling companies are making those kind of mistakes in places like Wisconsin, can we rely on them in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, or in Florida?
Might be better to rely on the Halloween costume retailer or Patrick's polls, which as I say, against the grain, against the trend. Patrick correctly predicted the Brexit result almost bang on, and the last election. He's and was actually cautious, if I remember rightly, Patrick, about the Conservatives' prospects in the 2017 general election, when many were expecting an overall landslide. What I want to move on to, because, polling, well, try and refine it if you can. Perhaps Freddy's right, it gets more and more complicated. But what I want to get into a little bit is, what are the drivers in America for whether people are inclined to vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden, inclined to plump for the Republicans or the Democrats? And Patrick, perhaps you can help me here. I'd kind of assumed, at least until quite recently, that the biggest cleavage or motivator in American politics was the class divide and income, more or less, right? That generally speaking, if you're affluent and you want taxes to go down, you might vote for the Republicans. If you're working class, you'd vote for the Democrats. Organized labor would vote for the Democrats. We seem to have experienced a major realignment now, right? That people are voting about based on their identity, their culture, perhaps, rather than the economy, which has probably been the decisive issue in many election campaigns, other than perhaps the last one and other than this one. What are the indicators, if you were just walking around a purple state in America and trying to work out whether somebody was going to vote for Biden or Trump? What are the key factors that would lean an American voter to identify with one column rather than the other?
Well, it's the best and the worst time. It's the best time to ask that question, and the worst time to answer it, because things are in flux. There's so much churn. 10 years ago, 10 years from now, an easier question to answer. But the divide now is it's very much about education. If you have a high school education or less, or some college, but you don't have a degree or a diploma, odds are that you're leaning towards Trump. If you go to church regularly, odds are you're leaning to Trump. If you're a gun owner, odds are you're leaning to Trump. This is one of the underlying factors here. Because of all the violence and all the peaceful protests this year, you have an enormous jump in gun sales, so to the point where you can't find any ammunition. 40% of those gun sales are women. And they're mainly women, single mothers and women in the suburbs, right? Those are folks who have made a decision that is going to lead them to vote for Donald Trump. Now, if you're an atheist, if you have a postgraduate degree, if you live in an urban area, if you're a white female, any and all of those things are going to lean you towards Biden, right? And so the battle, the battle's twofold. The battle is getting out your core vote in those demographic or consumer or sociological, anthropological groups, but also it's ensuring the other side doesn't water your side down. And I think the two best illustrations of that are African Americans and Hispanics, because if we're right, and if a number of the other polls are right too, then Donald Trump is going to get an unusually high proportion for a Republican of African American votes and of Hispanic votes. If he does that, it's very hard for Joe Biden to win because of the way those votes pan out across certain states. So it's becoming harder to say well, if you're black, you're definitely voting Democrat, because young black men are moving away, at least temporarily. And we're getting to the point, I think, after this election, we may have 4 in 10 Hispanics voting for the Republican. I mean, that's an enormous change. So it's shades of gray where what used to be, and maybe in the future, will be back to black and white.
Freddie, what do you make of this? Are we seeing voting trends now much more based on matters of identity rather than matters of income? I've got a chart in front of me here, which is quite interesting, that shows some of the factors that Patrick has raised. If you're an atheist, you're about 90% of them vote Democrat. If you're a born-again church-going Protestant, about 80% vote Republican. If you identify as LGBTQ, you're about 72% to vote Democrat. Postgraduate degree, Patrick mentioned, if you've got a postgrad degree, about 65% of you will be voting Democrat. Never been to college, marginal balance in favor of the Republicans. Income, however, an income of $15,000, so what's that, about 11,000 sterling, you're marginally more likely to vote Democrat, but only by a whisker. And similarly, an income of $100,000, so about 80,000 pounds sterling, you're marginally more likely to vote Republican, but almost within the margin of error. Freddie, are we seeing, the identity and your religion and whether you have a gun and whether you speak Spanish are now the determining factors of elections and political identity, rather than your views on, if you like, policy, traditional policy like tax and regulation and the rest?
I think that's certainly it. And I think the sort of cultural wars realign people's identities. I think it's not a good, clear divider because it's obviously a lot more complicated than that. But what you do have is a class divide in America. And it's hardening in the way that, the British class system hardened in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's becoming a part of your identity is not sort of your income necessarily, but whether you hold smart opinions. And the smart opinion is obviously to think that Donald Trump is horrendous. And then the working class, particularly the white working class opinion, and a small, perhaps as Patrick suggests, growing number of black and Hispanic voters, they are starting to feel that Trump is the only thing between them. The big line is often used: Trump is the only thing between them and kind of civil war, where the sort of rich will be all right because they're protected, but anywhere poor is going to be completely destroyed and ruined. And those are the sort of the ways in which the two sides line up.
Mark, this is sort of, I think, some of the mad genius electorally of Donald Trump. The conventional wisdom in the Republican Party after Romney lost in 2012 was that the Republicans had to reach out, quote unquote, to Hispanics and African Americans, which was code for how can we appease these people who don't like us, right? Now, Donald Trump comes along, and some of his competitors for the nomination were of that mindset. His comes along and he doubles down, as it were, and says, the system's against you. I'm on your side. He makes a non-ethnic, non-racial appeal that might sound counterintuitive to some. And so his growing appeal among African Americans and Hispanics is among working class, blue collar African Americans and Hispanics, especially male. So he's gained all this support among white male blue collar voters, but it's black blue collar voters, it's Hispanic blue collar voters who are going along with it. So he is exploiting or leveraging what Freddie's saying, which is this growing class divide. And it's arguably not been this larger divide in anyone's memory, which makes it harder and harder for people to poll it, and also suggests that the outcome could be more dramatic than we've seen in recent times.
Very interesting. Listen, I'm going to bring some more guests in at the moment, not to speculate about each possible outcome, but to talk through the consequences of Biden or Trump if they win. But I want to ask each of you, I'm quite keen to have a relatively early night next Tuesday, if I possibly can. Do I need to just stay up for Florida, and as soon as that's called, I can go to bed knowing who's won? Because that's obviously should be an early call because it's on the East Coast. Is that pretty much it? Is that the litmus test, Patrick? Once Florida's gone one way or another, I can go to bed knowing who's won. You're going to tell me it's not as simple as that, aren't you?
Yes, it's not as simple as that. If Biden wins Florida and he wins Florida early, then it probably is all over. But Florida may not be called for a while because the state's in 2 time zones, which makes it a little more difficult. But if Trump wins Florida, that means he's winning North Carolina and probably Arizona, and it means we go to the Midwest. That's what it means. So if everything plays out efficiently and smoothly, we could know late on Tuesday evening here in America. But given all of the mail-in voting, given the fact that each state has a different rule about how late they can arrive and whether they need a signature and all this stuff, it could be days. And if the vote is very close in some of those swing states, then whoever's on the downside is going to take it, bring legal action, and it could be weeks. You may be up for weeks or months.
Yeah, that's what I was worried about. Freddie, what's your take? Do you think we can, on this side of the pond, get to bed, at 1 o'clock in the morning, having seen Florida? Or do you think if this is close, we're in for some unbelievably drawn out fight that will actually end up with everything being determined in the courts, not at the ballot box?
I'm afraid I agree with Patrick. I think this could well drag out a long time. It's a nightmare for me because the Spectator goes to press at 1 o'clock on Wednesday, and I'm very, very worried it's going to be deeply uncertain by the time we go to press. I think, as Patrick said, if those early counties that declare in Florida, they tend to favour Trump. If we're seeing smaller than expected margins for Trump there, that might be a sign that we're in for a clear Biden win. But otherwise, if Trump wraps up the Sun Belt, then as Patrick said, it goes north, and that is a real nightmare in terms of trying to figure out what's happening. And with all these mail-in ballots, it could go until January. It could get that bad.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to, just before I bring in my guests, I'm going to leave you with another slide. If, like the IEA, you're a bit skeptical about forecasting, but you're less skeptical about markets, perhaps you want to know what the betting prices are. And it is true that over the last week that Trump's prospects seem to have improved. His odds are shortening while Biden's are lengthening. But according to the betting markets, the bookies say, I think this is based on an average between FTX Markets, Predict It, and Betfair, but Biden has a 62.7% chance of prevailing and Trump on 34.9%. However, 5 days before the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton was on a 71.2% chance, according to the betting markets, and Trump on 29.2%. And indeed, just as polls were closing, Patrick joined us from Trump Tower, and I asked him whether the 4-1 I could still get on Donald Trump was a good bet, and he said it was, and I put 200 quid on it there and then. So perhaps the polls are wrong, and perhaps I should have a bit less faith in markets predicting the future as well. Stay with us, gentlemen, but I want to bring some more guests to the table to talk about what the different outcomes might mean. Great pleasure to welcome back onto the show Terry Kibbe, co-founder, chief executive officer of the Washington-based Free the People, an organization which uses pop culture and video storytelling to turn on the liberty curious. In the past, she's been a senior advisor to fundraising efforts for Libertarian presidential candidate Gary Johnson and for Rand Paul's run for the presidency. Terry, welcome, welcome, welcome. You're joining us from the Washington area. I don't know whether you're in, where are you exactly?
I am on Capitol Hill, 2 blocks from the U.S. Capitol, so I am truly in the belly of the beast. I want to thank you, Ben, for having me on and to give me an excuse to day drink, because if I'm going to be talking about the election, the only possible way to get through this is with a cocktail or a glass of wine in my hand.
Terry, that's feeble. I know you well enough. You've never needed an excuse to day drink. Come on, come on. Also, a great welcome back to Oliver Wiseman, US editor for the Critic magazine, formerly the editor of CapEx, and before that, political editor at Standpoint magazine. Oliver, how are you doing, sir?
I'm good, thanks. I'm also in DC. Nice to be with you.
And we're also joined by Alexander Hammond. Alex Hammond is my policy advisor here at the IEA. He's previously worked in Washington, D.C. as a research associate at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. He was also a foreign policy fellow at Young Voices and an associate at the Charles Koch Institute. Good evening to you, Alex. It's going to be pretty difficult for me to trip you up on any of these questions because you've written most of them. So you should have pretty good foresight of what I'm going to ask you. Terry, let me start with you. You admitted that you were sort of already drowning your sorrows. How free are the people going to be in America come come next Wednesday. I mean, are you just tearing your hair out whatever happens from here, or is there anything to be optimistic about? Tell me there's going to be a late surge for Joe Jorgensen that hasn't been picked up in the polls, and that the Libertarian Party are going to sweep the Electoral College.
Well, first I want to talk about my experience voting yesterday. We voted early. We went down to the baseball stadium to vote. There were no lines. We walked right in, cast our votes for Joe Jorgensen, walked out, and were greeted by a food truck that was being sponsored by the World Central Kitchen. The World Central Kitchen was started by Jose Andres, a very famous chef, and his wife, to provide food and comfort to communities in times of disaster. And I thought the fact that they were at the polls just perfectly sums up what we're going through in 2020.
Yeah, sounds it. Oliver, what's your take on what's happening? We've heard from some pundits earlier, from Freddy and from Patrick. I mean, it's going to be exciting, isn't it? Even if you're depressed about what the outcome might be, even if you're depressed about either candidate winning, it's going to be one hell of an event come next Tuesday, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the interesting things about the polls and the Electoral College is the way the parties draw on their support at the moment. Is actually that the gap between a sort of blowout Biden win and a tight Trump win is remarkably small. So, like, if you imagine universal swings across the states we're talking about, we're not talking about a huge difference in support there. So that does mean it's sort of quite exciting or terrifying, depending on your point of view on election night.
Alex, are you excited or terrified, or a mixture of the two?
Always terrified, Mark. So
that's what having me for a boss is like, though, isn't it?
Indeed, yes. So what I'm partly most worried about is the fact of these mail-in ballots and how long they're going to take to count, as we don't know how long they're going to take. They could take 24 hours, they could take 24 days. And then the level of distrust between the two sides. There's a recent Monmouth poll that showed that 78% of Trump supporters have said it was very likely the Biden campaign would try to cheat in order to win, whereas 91% of Biden supporters said the same. So neither side trusts each other in this. And I know we'll talk about potential protests later in the show, but that's what I'm most worried about, and not optimistic in the slightest, I'm afraid.
Okay. Well, I want us to do, we've done a bit of predicting, but let's assume that despite your best efforts, Terry, that Joe Jorgensen will not be the first female president of the United States of America, and the Libertarian Party won't win, and that the only possible outcomes are Donald Trump or a Biden victory, even if they're prolonged and dragged through the courts. I want to try and imagine into the future, and let's start by assuming that the president is re-elected and we have a second Trump term. What is that going to look like? Now, I appreciate that 2016 to 2020 has been a pretty unpredictable period of time, made even more unpredictable by the unpredictability of the president himself. But what could we expect? And I just want to run through, Patrick, I'm going to ask you to give us your analysis of, insofar as we can predict it, and I appreciate this is harder than predicting how Florida or Pennsylvania might go. What would Trump 2.0 look like? He claims to have delivered on his promises. His tax plan passed. Corporation tax was brought down to 21%, not the pledged 15%, but it had come down from 35%. His income tax cut was largely a success. He pulled out of the Paris climate deal. He's reshaped the Supreme Court. I guess that wasn't a campaign pledge. That was a sort of act of God that allowed him to do that. He's taking credit for ISIS being largely defeated. He moved the Israel embassy. Construction of permanent US embassy in Jerusalem began last year. Military spending has increased. He got out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm not saying whether any of these are good or bad, just what he's done. He's brought many troops out of the Middle East, but not all. Ban on Muslims, current ban restrictions restricts travelers from Iran, Libya, Somalia, various others. Building a wall. I'm told as of late May, 194 miles of a wall had been built, but mostly to shore up dilapidated or outdated designs of the existing barrier. And out of 1,954 miles of border, just 3 miles of new wall has been built, according to the BBC. That's his record to date. He's had some good economic news today, Patrick, on the economy apparently rebounding in the States. What would we expect him to do if he's with us until 2024?
two areas I think he'll focus on. One is the traditional one for second-term presidents, and that's foreign policy. You ran through laundry list of actions, whether you view them as achievements, successes, or failures, and that's just the way it goes for second-term presidents. They tend to focus very much on legacy and where they're going to have less pushback from Congress. That tends to come in the foreign policy field. So you expect more of the same, more troops coming home, attempts to create, put together more quote unquote peace deals, all of that. Trying to keep defense spending up, resisting Democrats' pushes to do something about that. But the thing that is going to dominate initially, I think both because he would want to do it and also because his more rabid supporters are going to insist, is that there's going to be a very serious attempt to quote unquote drain the swamp. The level of frustration, to use a very polite word, that Trump, his people, and his supporters feel about the Washington scene. They are really going to try to take a meat cleaver to some of the dead wood, and not just the dead wood, but they would view as the rotting wood. Now, whether they have a success is another question, but that is going to be job one. And of course, the pushback from the quote unquote deep state will be intense. And of course, the media will be totally against what he's trying to do. Now, he may get so frustrated, he moves straight very quickly onto foreign policy, etc. But we have to look for some political bloodletting, bureaucratic bloodletting first, I think.
Terry, what's your take on this? What could appreciate we've got the most unpredictable man possible in very unpredictable times. So I won't hold you to this when I next meet you for a beer, but what would you imagine will transpire if we have Donald Trump as president of the United States for another 4 years?
Well, I need to disagree with Patrick on Trump draining the swamp. I think that one of the things that really drives Donald Trump is that he needs to be loved by everyone. And I don't think he's willing to take on the deep state and piss people off in his last 4 terms. I think he would rather want to be loved rather than drain the swamp. I haven't seen any effort in the first 4 years on draining the swamp. And so I don't really see that as one of his priorities in the next 4, if that happens. I think he would continue his push for deregulation. I think as far as the COVID response, he would focus on the vaccine and try to get credit for what happens in the private sector and say that it was because of me. Some of the tax cuts that he's done are temporary. He would work on making them permanent. And I think he would also work to reduce the cap gains tax a little bit more. That is the positive things that I see. The downside would be that he, just doubles down on Donald Trump, on being Donald Trump. But I think he also will want to spend like a drunken sailor and try to fix the economy, fix all of the problems of the economy that the economy is having now because of the government lockdowns and the government reaction to COVID. And he will try to pass a massive stimulus package with infrastructure spending and the like.
Oliver, what's your take? Where would, if it is Trump, where will he be taking America over the next 4 years? Will it be as unpredictable a roller coaster as we've witnessed to date?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Terry said about the spending and the domestic stuff. I think it's worth mentioning China, which no one's really discussed properly, and that I think would be this kind of new Cold War with China would suck up a huge amount of the oxygen. I think if we had 4 more years of Trump, I think it could end up, one of the interesting dynamics with Trump's foreign policy is he really has sort of kept his word on his kind of more isolationist or more kind of old school Republican approach to foreign policy. One of the ironies of his second term could be that he ends up his suspicion of China, which sort of has aged very well over his first term, kind of gets him and America into a Cold War becomes a hot war or something. I mean, who knows? But it with these games, it's always a question of what are none of us thinking about now that crops up, and I just think that China is certain to occupy a huge amount of everyone's attention. Actually, whoever wins, to be honest.
Freddy, is there a Trump plan for the next 4 years, or is it just going to be political theatre and being buffeted and responding to events in unbelievably unpredictable ways?
Well, I think there will be a concerted drain the swamp drive. A lot of talk about congressional term limits, which would be quite interesting. Healthcare, Trump will try and do this somewhat opaque secret plan to improve American healthcare. We're not sure quite how he's going to roll that out, but that will be on the domestic front. And I think, as everyone has suggested, it will be foreign policy. And what Trump has had in the last 3 years, is Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, who is highly intelligent, I think, and has a clear, possibly slightly dangerous agenda, but has been really effective in sort of ginning up support of other Western governments against China, trying to cultivate alliances against China, isolating Iran. That's been a key policy objective. I mean, I often hear, I'm very anti-hawks, but I often hear that the sort of hawks are just waiting for the second term, and then they're going to, nuke Tehran. But I'm not sure that is going to happen. I think that you have to kind of admire the guts of the Trump administration to go through with their Iran plan and their plans for the Middle East. And you have to say it's been effective.
Interesting. Alex, it was put to me by a libertarian-leaning friend in the States that he said to me that he hated everything Trump said but loved everything Trump did. I mean, that was sort of shorthand for saying that for all of the slightly boorish behaviour and occasionally bizarre behaviour of the president, he has actually cut taxes and deregulated quite substantially, right? I mean, if we expect more of that in a Trump second term, is that what free marketeers should be wanting, or is it a more mixed picture than that?
Well, I guess to a degree, it depends. I try and look at these things internationally as well as domestically. And on the international stage, we don't quite know what's going to happen next with Trump. If we do a UK-USA free trade deal, sure, we don't know exactly when that could go in, but we also don't know if Trump is just going to slap another 20% tariff on Scotch whiskey as he's done before. So it's very unpredictable on the world stage, but I definitely agree with what Freddy was saying when we're looking at Trump's policies. It's opaque. You go on his website and it's just more of the same rhetoric from 2016. It's the America First, build the wall, abolish Obamacare. However, one area he does actually do quite well in, but I don't think we talk about enough in the UK, is about the Second Amendment, especially when we compare it to Joe Biden. And I think that's an important area from many voters that isn't touched upon in these type of discussions abroad.
Well, that's why gun owners are tending to vote for Donald Trump, right?
Yeah, sure. They tend to be more so than Biden. And Biden has got plans regarding guns that I think won't be very good for America and would be deeply unpopular if he was elected, which kind of echoes in to the fact of more protests and more violence if he was elected and did start enacting his planned policies on guns.
Okay, let's have a look at the other side of the ledger then. If you're depressed, I should say also, if you're depressed about Trump winning or Biden winning or either winning, in about 10 minutes' time, you're going to have the chance to win 50 quid. There was a chance to win £100 last week. Nobody got it bang on right, but Peter Gill came pretty close. I can see he's in the YouTube chat at the moment. So, Peter, thank you for your email, and I will honour your relatively close guess by buying you a pint of beer when that's next legal in the United Kingdom. So probably see you sometime into the second term of the Mike Pence presidency on the present trajectory of freedom. But there's going to be a chance to win much easier. That's why it's only a 50 quid prize this time. So in about 10 minutes time, I'll give you that. So then you'll be able to buy a bottle of wine nearly as good as Terry's to drown your sorrows if you're pretty pessimistic about the way things are going on either side of the ledger. Terry, I want to come back to you on a Biden administration. What would this look like? I mean, already under Trump, In 2016, he aimed to clear the 19 trillion US dollar debt in 8 years. 4 years later, the debt's up to 26.7 trillion. Biden, and I was trying to pull together his sort of policy platform, you might say. It looks like fairly traditional left of centre sort of tax and spend, 2 trillion on climate change, 2 trillion on infrastructure, 775 billion on daycare for early childhood and home care for the elderly, 750 billion on making community college free for 2 years, corporate taxes from 21 to 28%, top individual income tax rate would go up back up to 39.6 from 37. Economically, Terry, is it a straightforward tax spend, bigger federal government, swampier swamp agenda from the Biden ticket?
Well, it depends whether or not the Democrats take control of the Senate. And that is still questionable. I mean, again, it's polling, so it's impossible to tell. They need to win at least 3 seats to at least have a tie, and then Harris becomes the tie-breaking vote. And I honestly don't know where that's going to fall. So I'm going to talk as if he has control of all 3 branches and can just do whatever he wishes to do. Yeah. I think he would probably be the next FDR. I think he takes this as just this massive mandate to spend all that he can. He'll, as you said, I mean, you gave all my talking points, Mark. I'm not really sure. I should just drink instead.
It was probably Alex who just stripped them off your website, Terry. Sorry about that. Yeah, we don't really respect intellectual property here.
Clearly not. I think the biggest thing that he'll do is try to do all sorts of national mandates for COVID. He'll try to push through a mask mandate, which won't go well in this country. We're still pretty individualistic, and what Biden thinks is good for New York City certainly doesn't work for rural Wyoming. I think that would be a huge problem for him. I think he will try to swing as far left as he can, but that's also what Obama did when he won. And so what happened was, after those 2 years, he pushed the envelope way too far, and the pendulum swung back, and Republicans got control of the House and the Senate, and that kind of kneecapped Obama for a lot of the things that he would do. So I'm just going to drink. Let's be honest.
That's the best answer to most problems, Terry. You and I can agree on that. Cheers to that.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Oliver, what would your take be? What could we expect from a Joe Biden presidency if he prevails next week?
Well, I think one of the ways I think about it is there's sort of 2 boxes of possible progressive changes that Biden could go for. One box is the substantive healthcare, economic policy stuff, and the other box is the kind of rules of American democracy box, or whatever you want to call it, the kind of process box. And that's things like packing the court, the electoral college, the filibuster in the Senate, and the 2 are obviously related in the sense that if Democrats are frustrated in their pursuit of something on healthcare, for example, that might sort of radicalize enough of them on the rules of the game. And I wonder, again, just sheer sort of punditry here, but I wonder if we look back on the first term of Biden and it's the rules of the game that have changed rather than the economic relationship between American citizens and the state. I sort of suspect that that's where increasingly, Democrats are increasingly convinced that the rules are rigged against them. They should have won 4 years ago. They should easily have a majority in the legislature. And so I think that's where I wonder if that will be where the energy is, but we'll see.
Patrick, what should we expect from Joe Biden? I mean, he's been around the block quite a lot. He first ran for president in 1988. He was first elected to the Senate in November 1972 when I was 6 months old. I think that when he first ran for president, there was most people on this call wouldn't have been of voting age, and some people who were joining us later wouldn't even have been born. I mean, is he to some degree a return to political normality there? He's a sort of straightforward, down the line, know where you stand Democrat, or would we get tax and spend on speed, do you think, Patrick?
Joe Biden has always billed himself, the media continues to build him as the moderate Democrat, right? When Obama chose him as his running mate in 2008, Joe Biden had the 4th most liberal voting record in the US Senate. He's been a pretty liberal politician, but his party has moved so far to the left that he's now a quote unquote moderate within the Democratic Party. Now, he becomes president. He probably will want to demonstrate he really is a moderate. I don't know if he'll have much luck even early on, because he's going to have to name all kinds of left-wingers to his cabinet. The base is going to demand all kinds of quote-unquote progressive, that is regressive policies. And we also have to bear in mind, and I think this is the key thing, is that in 4 years, we won't be looking back on the first term of the Biden administration. We'll be looking back on the first 2 or 3 years of the Harris administration, because Joe Biden is just not likely to either be able to or to want to suffer 4 years in the presidency. He is an elderly gentleman. That's not his fault. That's just an anthropological fact. And he clearly is not physically probably up to the job. So after a year or two, or maybe sooner, he'll choose to go away, he'll be moved aside, and it's going to be Harris. And Harris is going to have far less interest in acting in a quote-unquote centrist or moderate way. She is in many ways, at the exception of the drug war, one or two other issues, she's very much the acceptable face of the progressive wing of the party. So I think for whether it's Biden or Harris, the first 4 years would be pretty darn to the left.
That's interesting that you think that it's not just a question of talking about Biden's first term. He might not be there for an entire first term. I'm not wishing any ill health or ill fortune on either candidate, but being American president is a pretty dangerous job, right? 18.1% of American presidents don't leave the Oval Office alive.
He's already has said for some time, he's a transition candidate or transitional president. So he will not be running for re-election. So by the time the midterms are over in 2022, it's all about, even if he stays in the job, who the next Democratic candidate will be, which is, obviously Kamala Harris would be in the catbird seat, perhaps. So the Joe Biden conversation, it will be a very short-term one.
Interesting. And Patrick, before I let you go, as you know, we have the highly market-sensitive Live with Littlewood optimism barometer. You might base this in part on what you want to happen or on the early feedback you're getting from your polls. But how optimistic are you feeling? And I'll apply this for this US special to the United States about the prospects for the United States of America over the next 2 or 3 years. I know you might very well say, ask me that in 5 or 6 days' time. But from what you know now, what's your score out of 10 on optimism, Patrick?
About a 2.5, I'm afraid.
Sorry, there's a very strong rule here because I'm not very good at long division. It has to be an integer. So you got to pick 2 or 3.
Okay, I'll be half full. I'll say 3.
3. Freddie, let me come back to you before we say goodbye to you. What's your take on what a Biden administration would look like? What would you expect it to do? And how optimistic are you feeling, appreciating that nobody can yet say with any certainty at all whether it will be Biden or Trump come this time next week?
I mean, I think all your panelists have summed it up very well. I think it'll be the Obama era restoration. It'll be a strange sort of regency presidency at best, where Biden is sort of, wanders around the East Wing in his slippers while thousands of advisors make the policy. And I think Patrick's right. I think he probably will be shuffled out. I mean, hearing a lot of rumors about the 25th Amendment being employed, triggered, and it could be even for this China stuff that we're hearing so much about, which would be a very rich irony. And in terms of optimism, did you want my optimism now?
I want your optimism score now, yeah.
Well, okay, I've been very, very gloomy about America all year. But we did an excellent cover piece. I'm going to put a little plug in here if you don't mind. Excellent cover piece in the Spectator's US monthly edition called Still Exceptional. And it's all the reasons why Americans should not be gloomy. So I think in the short term, things are looking very gloomy, but in the long term, I'm optimistic. So I'm going to go with a 7. A 7.
Okay, so we're on a kind of middle track at the moment. Patrick, Freddy, thank you very much for joining us. Lovely to have you. We'll watch unfolding events from your part of the world, from this side of the pond, with great, great interest. I'm going to bring in 2 more guests. Terry, Oliver, and Alex, please stay with us. I'm going to bring in 2 more guests now, but I'm also going to give you the opportunity to win £50 I should make it very plain that it's of my own hard-earned cash. I'm not using any IEA resources on this. This will be straight out of my wallet. And I'm obliged, because of the extraordinary regulations that exist in the United Kingdom, to tell you that all of the terms and conditions and red tape is all explained in the show notes on YouTube, so you can look there. Last week's question was pretty difficult. It was, how many different ways can you make a break of 7 in the game of snooker? As I said, Peter Gill came the closest, so I'll buy him a pint, but nobody got it. This is a lot easier, this one. I'm going to ask you to pick the odd person out from 4 different people. Who is the odd one out and why? And I'm hoping, coming up on the screen now, I'll be asking our technical team to show you the 4 people and say who. All you need to do is to email me and tell me who is the odd one out. The first correct answer will get £50 of my hard-earned cash, so you can drown your sorrows with a good bottle of red wine, just like Terry Kibbe's doing. Here are the 4 people: John F. Kennedy, C.S. Lewis, Aldous Huxley, and Doctor Who. Who is the odd one out and why? Obviously, it needs to be what I've worked out about who the odd one out is. You can't say that the odd one out is this one because they're a completely mythological character. That's John F. Kennedy, by the way, who's a completely mythological character, not Doctor Who. Who is the odd one out of those 4 and why? If you email lwl@iea.org.uk, the first correct answer I get before Live with Littlewood next week will win £50. Who is the odd one out and why? Okay, let's welcome to the show 2 new guests. It's a great pleasure to have back on the programme Kate Andrews, the economics correspondent for The Spectator, formerly Associate Director here at the IEA, Head of Comms at the Adam Smith Institute back in the day. You can regularly see her on TV on the likes of the Sky Newspaper Review, BBC's Question Time. And I hope I'm not blowing apart Kate's privacy here. It says that despite being a lifelong Republican, actually I think she's mentioned this in The Spectator, Kate has reluctantly made the decision to vote for Joe Biden at the upcoming election. Evening, Kate. Good evening to you. Lovely to have you back with us. And we're also joined for the first time on the show by Morgan Schondelmeier, another former member of Team IEA, Head of External Affairs at the Adam Smith Institute, Masters in International Political Economy from King's College London. Good evening to you, Morgan.
Good evening to you, Mark. Good to see you again.
And where have you, Morgan, where have you put your money? Have you cast a vote yet?
I have, yeah. I voted absentee.
And is that between you and the ballot box, or are you wearing a pin and a badge loud and proud?
As an individual and not representing the views of my employer, I voted for Joe Biden.
You voted for Joe Biden. And Kate, you identify as a lifelong Republican. You voted for Joe Biden as well, right?
Yeah, I did, and it's definitely not a secret. It's online, and it was with a heavy heart. I don't have anything chilled in the fridge for the day after the election. I won't be running down the street celebrating. I haven't bought a T-shirt or a pin. I'm not thrilled at the prospect of a Biden-Harris presidency, but for me, it's all about the alternative, and that alternative led me to vote for Democrat for the first time.
Well, never let it be said that we don't allow dangerous radical left-wingers onto Live with Littlewood. There you go. You've 2 votes in the Democrat camp from 2 of our guests who have the vote, even though they're voting absentee from the United Kingdom. And I'm just going to ask each of you quickly who you expect to win. You're obviously hoping that Joe Biden prevails, but Morgan, do you think it will be a Democrat win, or impossible to say?
People much smarter than me find it hard to say, but I think it will be a Joe Biden win, yeah.
And Kate, is it in the bag for Biden? Have you piled your money onto him at 2-1 on? You know, you get a 50% rate of return over the course of the next 5 days.
Haven't used any betting websites this time round. I have done some personal bets. I still suspect it is Joe Biden's to lose. I think it's probably tightened in the past 2 weeks in Donald Trump's favor. And I think had he performed how he performed in the second debate, in the first debate, we could be looking at a significantly tighter race. As it turns out, when Donald Trump gave Joe Biden the opportunity to speak, and he was able to reveal certain forms of public policy that will not be popular with American voters, especially in swing states, I sense that Donald Trump started to gain some traction. But the reality is that the path to electoral college victory is harder for Donald Trump. It was in 2016, and it is now. And in many ways, the president was lucky in 2016. He won with 80,000 votes across 3 states. Not to say he didn't earn those votes, he did. It was a very legitimate result, and the Democrats in many ways got what they deserved. But you have to ask yourself, could a Democratic candidate win back those votes this time round? And I suspect Joe Biden can.
Okay. I want to move on to another topic, because we've said, who do we think's going to win? Can anybody judge that? What would be the consequences of either candidate winning? But I'm a little bit worried about the immediate future of the United States of America, irrespective of the result. We're calling this section America on Alert. Will the election result prompt violence on the streets of America? Everyone from charities, the police, the military, politicians, YouTube and Facebook seems to be expecting disturbances. There's been a turbulent summer already across much of America. Amnesty International says there were about 200 violent conflicts between protest groups, around 12,000 protests nationally. From May to September, Amnesty verified violent confrontations between protesters and counter-protesters in approximately 75% of all US states. And in about half of all US states, it confirmed cases of police forces failing to keep assemblies peaceful, failing to protect participants from violent confrontations. Are we now looking at the disunited states of America? The Independent reported that 72% of Americans are concerned about riots and violence after Election Day. 11 people were arrested on Monday in New York after a huge brawl erupted between Biden and Trump voters. The concern about potential flare-ups comes after Trump refused to say if he'll accept the result of the election, all these issues about postal votes. Biden's warned that Trump could spark militias on the streets. Oliver, this is a tinderbox, isn't it? I mean, I'm not wishing any of this to happen, but do you think, I'm going to ask all of our panelists this, are we in danger of losing the concept of loser's consent, that you sort of have a battle and an election, and it all relies on the defeated side accepting the legitimacy of the result? And however this goes, might there be a worry that doesn't happen this time, at least with a sizable enough of the American electorate to cause trouble?
Well, I am pretty disturbed by the way in which the president talks about this stuff. Frankly, I think that there's no other way of putting it. It's that side of things very concerning. And Trump certainly sort of fans the flames that are already burning sort of healthily without any help. So I think there is a nightmare scenario that it is not crazy to consider, in which there is violence and America has a fairly unpleasant couple of weeks. I would just add the caveat, though, that I think there's a sort of tendency, there's a sort of narcissism of this present moment where we sort of think we live in like uniquely chaotic and stressful times, and actually America's had bumpy elections in the past, and it will have bumpy elections in 100 years' time. That's not to say those moments weren't fraught and stressful moments, but we don't live in a uniquely divided United States. Unlike the word unprecedented is thrown around a lot, whereas actually I think America's had radicals rowing about things for centuries. So.
Kate, do you think that's right? That we're in danger of overstating this? Tempers are running high. The incumbent president's obviously a highly controversial kind of Marmite candidate. Or is something going badly wrong in our politics, possibly on both sides of the pond? You could argue that the Brexit issue here caused a kind of level of conflict and lunacy, whichever side of the debate you were on. Do you fear for America being united, whoever prevails?
That's an interesting comparison, Mark, to Brexit, because I would argue that politicians in the UK during those years, some really did try to thwart the result, to overturn it. And yet the British institutions held up just about, but the result that was voted upon in 2016 was then delivered. And I suspect that American institutions will hold up as well. I agree with Oliver. I'm also disturbed by the president's refusal to say that he will concede if it's very clear that he's lost, but I also suspect he will. And I think Joe Biden, who respects institutions, would concede if it were obvious that he lost as well. my biggest concern is that we're not going to have a clear result, not because of foul play, not because either candidate is being misleading, but because on the day it could very much look like in-person turnout is a win for Donald Trump, and then postal votes counted days later could overturn that result for Joe Biden. And I'm most concerned about a scenario where both candidates say that they are the victor and one of them has to back down. I think that would be the worst outcome for America, because you could end up with half of the voting population really feeling like something was taken away, and that concerns me a lot. I don't rule out much more worrisome scenarios. What we saw over the summer as largely peaceful and well-meaning protests did have some individuals that turned to violence, would suggest that there's an increasing appetite for that in America, and it does make me very nervous. But I think at the moment there is a desire on both sides, actually, to overstate how the other might react if they lose, when actually American institutions are extremely strong, extremely credible. I think they will hold up.
Terry, what's your thoughts on this? Now you've polished off your first glass of wine. Are you feeling a bit cheerier about things, Terry? I mean, I'm very worried about this, and maybe it's just we've gone through an odd period. But my sense is on both sides of the Atlantic that losers' consent is diminishing quite substantially, and our politics have become considerably more confrontational and poisonous and shrieking, and everybody tries to prove not that the other side is wrong or has the wrong solutions, but that the other side is insincere or wicked or evil. Certainly in America, it seems to me that the sort of overlap between Republicans and Democrats has ended. I mean, there's no sort of Rockefeller Republicans to the left of Blue Dog Democrats. So do we have a USA that is chronically and perhaps dangerously even divided? And if Kate says it, as Kate alluded to, if it's a close election, will this, whichever side eventually loses, potentially in a court of law, does that lead to things erupting in a really unpleasant way?
Well, I think one thing we need to remember is that 44% of Americans, I think that's the correct number, are now identify as independent. They don't want to associate with either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And I think that's something that's really critical to remember. I think the two parties are hopefully starting to lose their grip on the reins of power. And I'm hoping to see that shift more in the future. But as far as the current situation right now, I think it is definitely exacerbated by the lockdowns. I said this before. I don't think that the riots that happened in light of all of the racial tensions in this country would have been nearly as bad. The demonstrations, the violence, had people not been locked up for so long. I mean, people need an outlet, and that was an opportunity given to them. I would like to say that I don't think that there will be mass demonstrations, but I'm afraid that there probably will be, unless it is a very clear cut one way or the other on election day. I don't fear for my country. Our institutions are strong. I mean, we are set up to weather all sorts of storms. It may end up going to the Supreme Court, which brings up just a whole nother level of interesting outcomes, given the recent nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. I think we'll get through this. I mean, America's a great country. We've gotten through a lot worse, as others have said. But there is a risk of violence. I'm not for any particular reason. I won't be in DC that night. I'm hoping that Texas will be a better place for me to be than DC.
Morgan, what do you think? Am I just getting my knickers in a twist about this? That actually, when all's said and done, everything, America is a robust country. It will solve it all pretty simply. I'm remembering back, being a long in the tooth kind of guy to the 2000 election, which all, pivoted around a very small number of ballots cast on extremely dubious badly designed ballot papers in Palm Springs, wasn't it? Palm Springs, Florida. I bought one of the ballots off eBay after the election, I should hasten to add, not before the election to cast it. But Morgan, do you think this will be resolved in a fair sort of way, that we'll be able to shake hands afterwards and America will unite around whoever prevails? Or are we witnessing a country that's split down the middle, perhaps disastrously so?
I do agree with all of the other panelists, really, who have kind of touched on a lot of different issues. Alex earlier kind of mentioned the lack of trust that we have not only in each other, but also kind of in the voting system right now. There's a lot of misinformation out there about mail-in ballots, about absentee ballots. Every state has a different process. And if we do get to a situation where the ballots aren't counted, as Kate said, on election day, that's just going to be time for pressure to kind of build up, and it will have to be released somehow. So I think the closer the election is, the more we're going to have to worry about escalating tensions. And I think that kind of goes back to how close 2016 was. And Trump didn't win the popular vote, but that's because Hillary didn't strategically campaign about, how Patrick said earlier, her campaigning wasn't efficient. So if we have similar problems this time around, we might see the same kind of rejection of the results that kind of has been brewing for the last 4 years. People dissatisfied that Trump is president and have been dissatisfied for the last 4 years.
Alex, what's your take on this? And obviously the rules of the game are clear. It's about the Electoral College. But last time Hillary Clinton secured more votes than Trump. I guess it's well within the range of possible outcomes that happens again. The Democrats win more votes, but the Republicans win the college, even though it's very clear that that's how the race should be determined. I guess that some people might use that to raise questions of legitimacy. Do you think, Alex, having worked on the other side of the Atlantic, that this will all be resolved and sorted out one way or another through fair protest or fair process, or might this just lead to hysteria on either or both sides?
Yeah, so on this issue, I do think, despite the polls, the Independent said the other day that they found that 68% of people are worried the results aren't going to be clear. And that, coupled with like what Kate was saying about Trump telling people to go and watch the polls, which has meant that militias are planning on being outside some polling stations across the country. And as only a few states have laws against guns not being in the polling stations, it might make for some uncomfortable scenes. I'm not saying there'll be violence, but just visuals. However, I do think, I hope this, in the end, this is all just rhetoric. We've seen in the last few weeks about the whole Trump TV, him potentially planning his route out of the White House, in which Jared Kushner has allegedly been in talks with media outlets about setting up a Trump TV from January. And he has on Twitter for the last few months been hinting that Fox News needs a competitor, and it's not all that. So maybe that's his strategy, and this is all just bluster and rhetoric.
I don't know. I've never met Donald Trump, but he doesn't, from what I've seen of him, he doesn't strike me as the sort of man who's likely to be a particularly gracious loser. That's not the first thing that leaps to my mind when I think of him. Kate, it was put to me by somebody the other day, not that they had a vote, but that they didn't much care who wins, but they want somebody to win decisively, right? They want a blowout win for either Trump or Biden. Is that a kind of is that a sensible way to look at it, really? I mean, I know you've struggled over your question of how to vote for. I think last time as well, I think you were somewhat conflicted about who to vote for. But is the best thing for America to say that whichever candidate you want, really the best result is it's clear cut, and that we aren't going to get into some ghastly drawn out mess of finger pointing and arguments about mail-in votes or hanging chads or the rest?
I think that's a very good reason to want a landslide one way or the other, and not having strong feelings. I mean, it is a complex issue. Whilst I myself have never supported Donald Trump, and as you mentioned, Mark, I voted third party back in 2016 and have decided to vote Democrat for the first time now, I don't resent Trump voters. I completely understand what could draw somebody to wanting to vote for a candidate who completely rejects the 8 years of the Obama presidency, which left so many people behind, who acknowledges some of the deep institutional problems that America has, especially when you compare those who live in cities to those who live in more rural areas. And to want something decisive is really just to say that you want a bit of a break you want things to calm down. Now, actually, I think that's Joe Biden's platform, is that he is billing himself as that transition candidate. I don't expect to see him run in 2024. He's going to give people a bit of a break. I find that appealing, but I could see how there are different scenarios that give people at least an ability to breathe out, because there is so much concern that the more that this is contested, the more Americans themselves turn on each other. There's been some really interesting and worrying reporting out of Pennsylvania, possibly the most important swing state in this election, the one that I'm certainly going to be watching on election night, that even at rallies, people are starting to get violent with each other. People are getting aggressive, that there are real standoffs between Republicans and Democrats. It is an extremely divided country at the moment. Now, for me, this is a reminder that the larger the state gets and the more that the state has a say in what happens to you, what happens to your physical being, whether or not you're locked up or allowed outside, how much money you have to hand over, the more aggressive people get one way or the other, because they really feel like this election matters. I would like to live in a world where who the president of the United States isn't a conversation at the dinner table, because they just don't have that much power over your life. But that's not where we are at the moment. And people are getting very tense, feeling like if their guy doesn't win, that their lives for the next 4 years are going to really be worse off for it. So I don't blame people for wanting at least a decisive victory, but I personally am a bit skeptical that there aren't that many Americans out there who don't care which one it is. I think polling has suggested that very few Americans haven't made up their minds at this point as to who they're going to vote for. The question is whether or not they come out on election day.
Yeah, I was trying to work that out. What sort of person would be an undecided voter in America? You know, what sort of person would say, well, I don't think I've quite seen enough of Donald Trump to know whether I love him or hate him, right? I mean, presumably it's a question of you've made up your mind one way or another, but whether you're inclined to vote or not. I want to finish by moving on to a policy topic, and it's a bit of an advertisement as well. It's a new IA paper about healthcare policy. And Biden voters in America say in the polls that healthcare is their principal concern, although I was suggesting earlier that the economy isn't necessarily the defining basis upon which people will vote. Actually, Republican voters, Trump voters, say the economy is the most important issue, but healthcare is a colossal issue. And we've released a report written by Mark Tovey this week. Says the UK ranks 27th out of 36 OECD countries for the number of physicians. He's predicting that there's going to be a problem, that the crisis going to hit the NHS is going to be a lack of physicians. And he puts forward a whole range of suggestions about how we might tackle that. A lot of it is deregulating and allowing a range of different people to work in the medical field. For example, UK universities currently produce around 60,000 graduates a year with degrees in biological sciences, but very few of them actually go into the medical profession. It's extremely difficult to sign off things like prescriptions and all of the rest of it. And we're probably going to have to rethink that because of the impending shortage. Terry, let me come to you. Obamacare, the sort of hot, controversial topic of the Obama presidency, and then despite the Republicans' pledges to do so, wasn't unwound over the last 4 years. What's the state of the healthcare debate in the USA at the moment? Is the Affordable Care Act now likely established? That's just the way it's going to go, love it or hate it, but that's a sort of step change and is now in aspic? Or do you think healthcare policy in America might change radically dependent upon the outcome on Tuesday?
Well, I don't think it will change radically either way. I mean, they will both work as they can. Trump will work to try to chip away some of the more onerous sections and parts of Obamacare, while keeping things that have been popular, such as making sure that if you have a pre-existing condition that you can get health insurance. They made healthcare as one of the defining issues with bringing in ACB into the Supreme Court, because they were saying that if she gets on the Supreme Court, that Obamacare is going to go away and everyone in America is going to be left without health insurance, which we all know is not going to happen. I haven't seen that it is as big of an issue in this election as some people might be making it out to be. I mean, COVID is, but the healthcare requirements for COVID, right now, my insurance company, by mandate, pays for 100% of any COVID-related expenses. So there's no additional mandates that need to happen. I don't think that it's been as big of an issue as the press or the Democrats are trying to make it out to be.
Oliver, what's your take on this? I mean, the Democrats, to some degree, have been implying, perhaps not so far as explicitly stating, that universal healthcare will be out of the window if Trump wins. I thought Obamacare was supposed to be unpopular and led to Republican gains during the Obama administration, but is it now solidified as the healthcare system America's going to have for some time? Or might it be doubled down on if the Democrats prevail and unwound if Donald Trump prevails?
Well, I think the main force in US healthcare debate is inertia. So basically, as soon as entitlements are created, or whether that's public entitlements or private schemes people like that they get through their employer, people are incredibly reluctant to risk anything when it comes to their healthcare policy that they have. And that explains the pushback against Obamacare. It also explains I think we shouldn't be too soft on Republicans here. The epic flop that is the Republican promise to come up with their own answer to the healthcare question, which they've had plenty of time to do. And I think even as of a week ago, Trump's sort of saying he's got this super top secret, amazing healthcare plan he can't wait to tell people about. I think that we've sort of lost our way a bit in the healthcare debate. People talk about the endpoints, whether that's what Republicans or Democrats like, and really the thorny thing is kind of getting from A to B. It's how you get from if you want Medicare for all, how you get from here to there on the left, and the same sort of on the right. And I don't think anyone has a very constructive plan, frankly, to do that.
Morgan, which healthcare system is more catastrophically awful, the Americans or the British?
I guess that depends on what you value. I don't think either work the way they are. I mean, the huge problem with American healthcare before Obamacare was that there wasn't as much universal coverage. People with pre-existing conditions could be denied care. And if you believe in, healthcare as a human right, again, it is, a Democrat talking line. But if you think that people should be covered, then that is a huge issue. Again, in the UK, we have tons of issues with deliverables, meeting targets. We've seen an entire crisis here where no one's getting treated for anything unless it's COVID. And I think that's going to be something that's going to haunt us for many, many years to come. And we need to have a conversation about it. But I hate this UK versus US dichotomy, and I try to get away from it as much as I possibly can.
Well, both systems are pretty bad compared to a good number of alternatives in the rest of the Western world, right?
It's exactly. And that's why having conversations about healthcare in the UK is so hard, because the automatic retort is, well, you just want an American style healthcare system, which is absolutely not true. I don't think anyone really thinks that the American style system is something to be applauded. It has a lot of issues. And there are reforms that can be made and hopefully will be made. But it certainly isn't a system to aspire to.
Kate, you rose to national prominence, being accused of only wanting to change the NHS here in the UK in any way at all because you desperately wanted poor people to die in waiting rooms in America because you wanted that system. You must be furious about the debate, which is just so Anglo-centric, comparing our healthcare system with America's. What's your take on where the US has got to since the Affordable Care Act and where it might go now? And actually, from our side of the pond, do you think the Americans are slightly onto something with the Affordable Care Act? You might argue about the delivery, but that they're embracing universality. And don't you want universal healthcare within some sort of market mechanism to provide it? Or are they going wholly down the wrong path, Kate?
Yeah, what a lovely thing to be known for, Mark. You raise a very good point, actually, that in the US, Obamacare did not get rid of the insurance-based system. In fact, it embraced the private sector that people needed to have insurance. And my major issue with Obamacare is that you have people moving on to a public-style system very often if they can't afford healthcare. And also, by forcing people to buy a product that is so highly regulated. I'm not talking talking about safety standards. I'm talking about cronyism, that it's very difficult to get any variety in that sector. You essentially establish these insurance companies, which might as well in many ways be run by the government because it's not a real free market system. There's no meaningful competition. So it entrenched cronyism and it moved more people onto a public system. I'm all for embracing market mechanisms in healthcare as they do throughout Europe, throughout Asia. I mean, all around the world, you have significantly better healthcare systems that often see the state topping up people who couldn't otherwise buy that healthcare, but then using the private sector to efficiently deliver it. And unfortunately, Obamacare missed so many tricks. It did have insurance-style systems in place. It could have really liberalized that market. It could have helped people to afford healthcare, but it missed all of that. I wasn't sorry. I'm not sure if it was Ollie or Alex that said it, but I absolutely agree that you cannot let the Republicans off the hook for this. I think it was Ollie that said this. They campaigned for 8 years under the Obama administration to give them power so that they could overturn Obamacare and bring in a market-friendly system that still helped people access healthcare. And they completely have failed to do so. And Donald Trump had the Senate, he had the House, he could have done it, and he didn't. So I'm not very generous to either party in the United States. As Morgan says, it's nothing to emulate. The US needs so many structural changes to its healthcare, but let's not pretend that we're lucky to have the National Health Service when you have France and Germany and Sweden and Denmark and Norway and all of these countries right around us who are doing significantly better in providing access to service in the UK.
Alex, why didn't the Republicans have a plan? What is Donald Trump's secret plan? I think it was Oliver. Why has the Republican Party been so weak on this? Or is it is it think tanks haven't done the groundwork for them, or have think tanks done the groundwork and they just haven't bothered reading it, Alex?
Well, it's hard to say. I know my old workplace, the Cato Institute, has done a lot on healthcare and the best ways to try and add more market to it because I think we can all agree here, an entirely free market healthcare system isn't going to happen in our lifetimes. But I don't have too much intelligent things to say on the American system. But one of my main hopes from COVID-19 going forward is that countries that have done particularly poorly within their healthcare systems, especially in the UK and the NHS, maybe take a look around for once and just have us look and be like, okay, Germany's got 4 times less deaths than us right now. How come? What's up with that? Why are people waiting months on end for urgent appointments on the NHS like I currently am? So I just hope that, especially amongst just normal general public, have a look around and see it's not NHS or America, and coronavirus actually gives us time to reflect on other ways of doing healthcare that can also be extremely successful.
Jerry, what's your take on this? Where should we go here? This is, I think, healthcare policy is a thorny issue, which we probably got badly wrong on both sides of the pond here, and actually got quite a lot to learn from some Western European countries in order to improve our systems and indeed the way that markets can operate effectively within the system. What's your take, Terry?
Well, I think that people forget why America got in this situation that they are in today with healthcare. It was during maybe the 1970s, during wage and price controls, where the government decided that, industries and companies couldn't pay their employees anything more. So they came up with other ways to compensate them. And one of those ways was to give them health insurance, because the companies could write it off as a business expense and individuals couldn't. So our insurance has, for the most part, been tied to our employment, which is completely messed up. So one of the proposals that was put forth, I think by Senator Rand Paul, was to change that, to allow people. So right now you can either get your insurance through your employer or through one of the Obamacare healthcare policy banks. And Rand put forth a proposal that said that, you could join associations, like your gym could provide health insurance, the art could provide health insurance. So that is a very market-oriented proposal that I think would go a long ways. There's a lot of market solutions that could be enacted, and I have no idea why the Republicans didn't act on any of them.
Can I just press you a little bit on that, though, Terry? The interesting thing for people in the think tank community is that those of us who work in think tanks can think the unthinkable, say the unsayable, do the blue skies thinking, and then it's sort of the job of politics to pick that off the shelf at the right time. Why didn't that happen in 2016 when this was an area of policy that had been so controversial, so many people working on it, and then essentially the political party that was opposed to the status quo had the House and the Senate and the presidency, and there didn't seem to be a blueprint? I'm bewildered.
I am too. I can't fathom why the Republicans weren't more forceful on this. Maybe, even though Trump talked about it, it wasn't one of his real, primary things that he wanted to push forth, and people just followed his lead.
Okay. I'm going to round up by asking each of you 2 questions. As you'll be aware, there's the Live with Littlewood highly market sensitive optimism barometer, which we're applying to the United States of America today, which is, how optimistic are you that the United States of America will be a free and prosperous country in 2 to 3 years' time? 10 is it's nearly achieved utopia, and 0 is it's become North Korea. But I'm also going to ask you, what's the best thing, the single biggest and best change you're hoping to see in the USA in the course of the next 2 or 3 years that you think, if it came about, would dial the number you're about to give me in an upwards direction? Oliver, I'm going to start with you. How optimistic are you feeling, and what change would you like to see in the States that would lead you to give a higher rather than a lower number?
I'm going to, the sort of contrarian in me, because I suspect people are quite gloomy, I'm going to say 9. I'm going to go high because I think, don't sleep on America. I think Trump's going to lose. I think that's a positive development. And I guess the second question about the sort of positive development is probably concerns the future of the Republican Party and whether after Trump they I don't mean just pretend Trump never happened, but can avoid a sort of Trump 2.0 where they go further down their populist path and they sort of regain their senses and come up with a sort of sensible, more serious approach to politics. So that would be my take.
Wow. Okay, I should have come to you last. Finish on a 9 would have been pretty upbeat. Morgan, where are you on optimism for the USA over the next 2 or 3 years? And what's the change that you incredibly like to see that would dial up your level of optimism?
I was going to go with a 4 until you said that North Korea was the bottom level. So I'm going to up it to a 6 in that case. I have a little bit more faith in the US than North Korea.
So you're very optimistic that the USA will be a better country than North Korea in 3 years' time. Okay.
That's the metric you gave me. So I'm going to go with a 6. In terms of a shift I'd like to see over the next couple of years is new, fresher, younger politicians. I mean, it's like you said, Joe Biden's been a politician.
You're a big fan of AOC, are you?
No, not necessarily. But I think that having new people kind of injecting a bit of vivacity and kind of new ideas into the both parties. I really liked Pete Buttigieg. He didn't have the experience. He was never going to win, but I liked what he was saying. I think Nikki Haley could be that for the Republicans, kind of getting people that haven't been in Congress for eons as front runners in the parties. I think that would be a positive shift.
Well, that doesn't really sit hand in hand with you voting for Joe Biden. He's been around forever and a day, hasn't he?
I know. But
Alex, what's your take on it? How optimistic for the USA over the next 3 years in terms of its freedom and prosperity? And what credible change would you like to see that would, if it happened, likely dial up your Live with Littlewood optimism barometer rating?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question first. The policy I'd most like to see is Joe Biden has hinted at it in the past, and it's unsurprising because it was negotiated under the Obama administration, is if America was to join the comprehensive and progressive agreement for a Trans-Pacific Partnership, the very lengthy CPTPP, used to be TTIP. And I think that'd be amazing if they were to join it. Then the UK would join it. Suddenly, we've got 33% of global GDP under a single free trade agreement, compared to just about 14% for the EU, 13% or 16% for China. You've suddenly got a huge block, not only trading goods between each other freely, but then it can rival the power of China over the coming years, which is undoubtedly going to be an issue. But as I say, he's only cautiously hinted at that. So it's a long shot, but that's my one big policy hope. And in regards to optimism, I think we've seen in this discussion, neither candidate's going to be good. At least in 2016, we all seemed surprised about how awful the candidates were. But this time around, we've accepted this caliber. And generally, I feel bad saying this because I did devote the beginnings of my career at humanprogress.org, one of the most optimistic websites in the world. But I'm not really optimistic for the future of both the world and the US. Economic freedom is declining. Poverty is increasing at a rate that hasn't happened in my lifetime before. COVID and the policy debate around it is going to go on for years. And we're probably going to go back into lockdown soon.
God.
And what a time to be alive.
And on top of that, the lockdown will mean greater deficits, which we'll spend the rest of our lives paying off. Although, I guess, based on the Mark Tovey report, we're not going to be very long lives if the NHS has gone down the pan. So I was going to initially give a 1, but I am a bit more cheery. I am a bit more cheery talking to you guys tonight. And if North Korea's 1, I'm going to give it a generous 2.
Bloody hell, don't come to the office next week, you miserable old sod.
I'm staying Buckingham is the land of the free, tier 1.
A 2. Terry, let me come to you. What's the change you'd like to see, a credible change you'd like to see that you think would lead you to give a higher figure? And what is your actual figure for the Live with Littlewood optimism barometer for the USA in the next 2 or 3 years?
So I'm still optimistic, sort of. I'm going to give us a 7. The US, as I said before, we're resilient. We've faced worse crises than this. As far as policy change, I think we need, as a country and as a world, to look at the fact that these lockdowns are such a failure. People are dying because they're locked up. The economies are tanking. Small businesses are going under. And the government thinks that all they need to do is just spend more money and it's all going to go away. So I think that what we need to do is recognize that this is not going to solve this, and also recognize that any president, if it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden or any singular person, can solve this problem. That's putting too much faith in a single person. It's just impossible. But I think getting rid of these lockdowns and getting back to a more freer economy, we're allowed to leave our homes. France just entered in as of midnight tonight. They are back into their 23 hours lockdown in their homes. And I think it's going to happen more and more across Europe. So I think,
but only in the very short term, right? I mean, over the medium term, surely to God, we're going to get back to normal. Do you not think?
I hope so. But remember that this lockdown law here in the US was supposed to just be for 2 weeks. I mean, this has been the longest frickin' 2 weeks of my life. I mean, this was March now till November, and things aren't open. I still can't, go on and eat in a normal restaurant the way that I used to do. Things are still closed. I think it's been a government power grab, and that they will keep trying to do it, and we just need to stop it as much as we can. And while taking the appropriate precautions for people. I mean, sure. I'm not dismissing that this is a problem.
Yeah, it's sort of it's grindingly depressing, isn't it? I mean, I'll confess to the fact that I think the first week or 2 of lockdown I found quite exciting in a kind of bizarre, masochistic sort of way. But now, I mean, 6 months later, it's just grindingly grim. So let's hope that can be resolved and we can open our economies and our lives up again. Kate, the final word and number goes to you. I've added everything up to date, so I'm ready to do my long division when you give me your number. But what's the change you'd like to see that would make you more optimistic? And on the Live with Littlewood optimism barometer, how optimistic are you feeling about the USA over the course of the next 2 or 3 years?
Well, the change I'd like to see that I think we will see is meaningful criminal justice reform. There's quite a famous debate from 1980 where Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. debate each other as to who loves migrants more, who's more pro-immigrant. And that really when Ronald Reagan won, that was really implemented in his public policy. And I think we actually saw something similar between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in the second debate when they were debating who would be better for criminal justice reform. It's so hard to imagine that even just a few years ago. America has such a problem with disproportionately locking up nonviolent offenders and with innocent, non-armed people being shot in the back in the USA. And both parties seem to have finally acknowledged this. So I'm very optimistic about that one particular area. And I think if Trump wins or if Joe Biden wins, we'll see meaningful reform there. I'm very excited about that. In terms of the barometer, I'm going to give it a 5. I suspect if Joe Biden wins, that we will be able to take a deep breath out. We'll be able to reset. I won't like a lot of his economic policy. I think I will like his free trade policy, as Alex alludes to. So that will be a bit of a mixed bag. I'm giving it a 5, though, just because I think Americans really need to sit back and reflect. I'm so concerned that we're not going to learn the lessons of the past 4 years. The Republican Party embracing a protectionist, frankly, very often, in my opinion, racist candidate to represent free markets and free people. And on the Democrat side, a refusal to accept that he did win legitimately, and an attempt to use every single institution apart from democracy to undermine him. And so I'm very hopeful that we can all reflect on that, and that if we were just to take a little bit of a break, we could move forward to a much brighter future.
And Kate, do you think if Donald Trump is defeated, the Republican Party will revert to something that you're more comfortable with? Or do you think he's changed the Republican Party forever? It's going to be unrecognizable. It's a different beast now.
I don't think he's changed it forever. I'm not at all confident that we'll go back to the Ronald Reagan style of policy and governance. But as Morgan says, perhaps some new people, some new ideas can come into the party and we can be even better than we were before. But I think it's important for Trump to leave now, because I think if Trump goes, so does Trumpism. The reason that he does so well is because he's a winner, in his own words, right? He loves to win. Once he's a loser, I suspect he will be tossed aside. And that's very important if we're going to get back to those principles that made the party great.
Okay, I'm afraid my number was only a 2, because despite the encouraging emails I've received from Terry about the surge for Jo Jorgensen in states like Alaska, I don't think it's going to be quite enough to carry her over the line in the swing states. So I think we're going to end up with one of Donald Trump or Joe Biden. That's a 2. That means that we aggregate out at 41 is the overall total, divided by 8 of us, 5.125. Just by a smidgen more optimistic than average, but by a tiny, tiny smidgen. Thank you to all of my guests for their contributions and their thoughts. My thanks to Terry Kibbe, Oliver Wiseman, Kate Andrews, Morgan Schondelmeier, and Alex Hammond. My thanks too to Patrick Basham and Freddy Gray, who joined us earlier. If you've enjoyed this evening's show, be sure to subscribe to the IEA London YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe option and hit the notification bell. That will mean that you get notice of our upcoming broadcasts. Please visit our website, iea.org.uk, where you can sign up for our newsletter. A special thank you to all of our donors. It's only thanks to your financial support that we're able to carry out this activity. If you can help us financially in any way at all, then you can find details on how to donate to the IEA on our website and in the show notes below. And again, in my personal crusade to try and cheer somebody up, you can win 50 quid, 50 pounds sterling of my hard-earned money if you can send me an email telling me who the odd one out is of these 4 people: John F. Kennedy, C.S. Lewis, Aldous Huxley, and Doctor Who. And it must be the thought I've got in my head about who the odd one out is. Once you've got it, it's pretty easy. Thank you for joining us. Watch the stars and the stripes. Fingers crossed that next week goes as smoothly as possible, whichever side you want to win. Thanks for joining us, all of you on the YouTube chat. Thanks again to my guests. Stay safe, stay free. Over and out.
Thanks, Mark.